And now it's time for Omniversica, the greatest show on the internet, with your hosts, Dan Schneider and Art Durkee.
Greetings. Welcome to the April 2003 edition of Omniversica. My name is Arthur Durkee. I'm here with my co-host Dan Schneider and co-producer Dave Wesley. This month's program, we're going to be focusing on music, specifically two kinds of music, American pop music or classic pop music, or, well, pick a category. There's many things to call this, but great music, I think, is the best way to do it. In our first segment, we'll be speaking with Marc Taylor and talking about classic soul music. Might want to mention that Marc's website is www.touchofclassicalsoul.com. He's got a couple books out as well. And in our second segment, we'll be speaking with jazz expert Robert Levin about free jazz, Ornette Coleman, John Coltrane, that whole new thing that came up partly as a reaction to all the stuff that was going on in the 50s and 60s. So here's my co-host Dan Schneider, and we will bring Marc Taylor on board to talk about some soul music.
Thanks, Art. Actually, it's touchofclassicsoul.com, not classical.
Oh, sorry.
But anyway, Marc, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
Good. Now, just so people know, anyone who's read any of my essays or knows me personally knows that I'm not a big fan of cronyism in the arts. So I want to be up front and say that Marc Taylor is an old friend of mine from decades ago that I recently came into contact with. But I'm not pushing the music or his book because he's an old friend, but because it's interesting music that I enjoyed when I was a kid, and Marc obviously enjoyed a lot more. Now, just to give a little bit of background, Marc had started this touchofclassicsoul.com website and has been selling two books there, Touch of Classic Soul, I guess number 1 and number 2, focusing on the early and late 70s. And Marc, in reading your book, I know you were listening to music. That seemed to have been your whole world as a child. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got into this particular brand of music?
In a sense, you hit the nail right on the head. It really was my world as a child. It was whenever my parents brought home a new single or album, it was like a big event in my life. And my things are kind of blurry as far as way back when I was 2 or 3 years old. But I distinctly remember a lot of Motown music being played at my grandmother's house during Easter, Christmas, Thanksgiving, whichever holiday, we were always there. And I guess being the youngest of 18 grandchildren, music, I guess, was my best way to communicate. Well, my love of music was my best way to communicate with my cousins and aunts and uncles and on up. So I really think that's how I got into it at such an early age.
So are you a frustrated musician at heart?
No, I can't play, can't sing. I just love listening to it, and eventually I evolved into writing about it.
Now, I know you had sent me a package of, including your two books. How have you done in terms of, because this is your own self-publishing venture, and I know obviously you were in contact with some of the stars from the 70s, but how have you done as far as sales and also as far as getting recognition for compiling this sort of neglected era?
Sales been pretty good. As you said, it's self-published, so it's it's really it's all on me. I get help here and there as far as book signings, and I've had some success in bookstores and primarily libraries. I've got a couple of good reviews from library sources like Library Journal and Booklist, so that's helped quite a bit. But it's when you want to do it your way and not conform to anyone else's standards, this is what you have to do. Yeah. And I do everything I can to get it out here.
Yeah. Now, before we hit our first break here, I just wanted to ask, the 60s and 70s, I was thinking in reading your book that I probably know about 35 to 40% of the artists in the two books, and yet if I go back just a decade earlier to the 1960s, I could probably double those figures and know about 75 to 80% of the artists from that era. And I think when most people think soul music, they think Motown in the 1960s and whatnot, and I'm just wondering, Why do you think that is? Do you think the 60s was better music? Or, I've always had this idea that the people who are the first in any endeavor seem to get overpraised, like, a William Shakespeare or the Beatles tend to get overpraised in their areas vis-a-vis later comers on, and I'm wondering if you think that's the same in soul.
I think to some degree that is the case, and really when you think soul music, immediately Motown comes to mind. Mm-hmm. And that there's some validity to that, because so many great artists came from the Motown label. And in the 70s, they kind of, being that they followed Motown, they didn't quite get the recognition. And Motown was still around in the 70s also, although not quite as, the impact wasn't quite as great as their impact in the 60s. So I think that's what it was. They followed the great success of Motown.
Okay, well, Mark, we're going to listen to a song now from some of the songs that you sent me that you might want to hear played. And when we get back, we're going to actually talk some definitions about what soul music is versus other types of music. So let's listen to one of these songs, and we'll be back with Mark Taylor.
Okay.
Okay, we're back here on Omniversica number 4 talking with soul music maven Mark Taylor. And want to get into this section a little bit about what soul music is. I think a lot of people, you had mentioned in an earlier segment, Motown is soul music to probably 95% of the people out there. And I was just looking through your book, and a lot of definitions of different music: soul, Motown, blues, jazz, rap, doo-wop, rhythm and blues, R&B, disco, funk, and a lot of the bands, are listed in the book, as soul bands. But when I think of like a George Clinton, I think funk. And how do you sort out the difference between soul and Motown and R&B and funk,
or even disco, for example?
Well, there's really it's really all a gray area, because for example, you take an artist like Donna Summer,
right?
Now her songs really wouldn't be considered soul music, but all of her hit records during her heyday were played on stations that were predominantly rhythm and blues or soul, whichever the term was called at that time, soul, and then it became politically correct to call it rhythm and blues. But you really wouldn't consider her music soul music. Really, in many ways, radio program directors determine what's soul and what's not, as far as what we're going to play and what we're not going to play. And it's not simply as easy as saying, okay, this person's an African American artist or an African American group. We're going to play their records on soul music stations. For example, you take the '60s group, The Fifth Dimension. Their music was not considered soul.
Okay.
It just had a very light pop. I think one of their biggest hits, "Up and Away."
Yeah,
didn't chart at all on what was then the soul chart, which is now the R&B charts. So it's a lot, and many times it comes down to radio program directors or radio personalities, if they have that clout, as to what they're willing to play. So soul, to me, it's a combination of rhythm, blues, jazz. It's a whole mixture, and several artists who are in the book, and I may not consider, like you said, a George Clinton or Donna Summer. Chic was a disco band. Perhaps they wouldn't necessarily be considered soul in the same vein as an Aretha Franklin or an Otis Redding. However, if their singles did do extremely well on the R&B charts, which was the new name for the soul charts, I felt they should be included.
Yeah, you mentioned Up and Away, and I remember in the late 60s, early 70s driving up with my parents to New Hampshire for a week getaway, and I remember that song, Up and Away, and Rhinestone Cowboy, listening to those songs endlessly. I hate both songs.
Okay.
But I was just wondering, how much of this labeling, is really a remnant of sort of the 1950s race music kind of category. I mean, when we talk, soul music, I mean, I've heard some people talk, about like the Righteous Brothers or Hall & Oates even as being blue-eyed soul. I mean, how much is, the distinction of soul meaning black?
Well, yeah, that's it's very easy to categorize a song by a black artist as soul music, and just the complete opposite. But Hall & Oates, if you listen to especially their early hit, Sarah Smile and She's Gone, that's soul music.
Mm-hmm.
Same with the Righteous Brothers. And in retrospect, a lot of Motown now, 30-plus years later, is not really considered quote-unquote soul music. The Supremes, most of their songs did very well on the soul charts, but in retrospect, people look at them as, okay, well, high-gloss pop.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same with several artists who came from Motown, whereas much of the more grittier songs, like an Aretha Franklin or Wilson Pickett or Sam and Dave, Otis Redding, that's considered pure soul music. So, like I said, it's really a gray area, and it's...
Is there a musical stylistic thing that ties it together somehow, a vibe or a feel?
A lot of it is just that feel, emotion. The more emotion you put into a song, it's more easy to classify it in as soul music, whereas it's, again, more high gloss, just light and airy tune is considered pop, so-and-so out. Like, for instance, Dionne Warwick didn't have a great deal of emotion in her songs, and her songs are not really considered soul music. I don't know how, I can't recall offhand how well her songs did on the soul charts, but her music really wasn't considered soulful.
Well, yeah, because most of them were Burt Bacharach written
tunes. Yeah, and when she wanted to do something soulful to, as they say, recapture her black audience, she had to team up with the Spinners for Then Came You, because the Spinners were hot at the time.
Right.
And they had like 4 or 5 straight songs that were number 1 on the soul charts. So that was really the purpose behind that, for her to, recapture her black audience, and on the other hand, for the Spinners to move in a bit into the high gloss area that Dionne Warwick fit into.
Now, let's backtrack a little bit about the history of soul music. I know on your website, your publishing company is named for your grandmother, spelled backwards. But I'm wondering, what kind of music did she listen to? I mean, did this evolve from like jazz itself, or is it gospel? I mean, I'm sure you've probably researched going back, through the 20th century and before. How did soul music become soul music?
Well, it really started. I can go back as far as the 50s, and you mentioned this term race music, and really when rock and roll came in, that's when it became music became a bit more blurred, and it was more acceptable for all races to be listening to all kinds of music. And that was the case with the 60s also. And really, Motown, they're very Gordy. His goal was to sell his music to the pop mainstream consistently, not just a hit here, a hit and miss here and there. But his goal was to sell to the pop mainstream, and that's why when you think of soul, you think of Motown, because that was the first group of artists that consistently sold their songs across the board. And I think that's really where it evolved into.
Another thing too that I've always noticed about a lot of the Motown and a lot of the songs from the 60s is, I mean, I'm not a music expert by any means. Art knows a hell of a lot more about music than I do, but structurally, I find them a lot nearer to old-type European ballads than they are necessarily if you think of the pulsing rhythms of, sort of African or, Bob Marley kind of beat. And I'm just wondering, is again the idea that soul music is necessarily just of black origin? Is that something that is just a convenient label? Because structurally thinking, when I think of some of those great tunes from the 60s again, which I'm more familiar with, I think that there's a lot of European tradition behind that as well, rather than just being, from African descent.
Well, a lot of the at Motown, most of the songs, the same band played behind them, and many of the band members at Motown, a lot of them are classically trained.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And they didn't just pick it up and start. They didn't wing it. A lot of them are classically trained.
And what wasn't that backup band? Don't they have like a documentary out recently?
Yeah, the funk. They were called. It was called "Standing in the Shadows of Love."
Yeah, and weren't they like inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame recently?
I think they were. Yeah, but collectively they're known as the Funk Brothers.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, I mean, generally speaking, then, what is your basic personal attraction to soul music versus, say, rap or rock and roll or pop? I mean, is there something just fundamentally in soul music that draws you to it?
Well, you mentioned rap. I guess rap is kind of ironic. And when I listen to a rap song, I guess it's like a little game with me. I try to figure out, okay, what song from the 60s, 70s, or 80s is this rap song sampling?
Right.
Every song I hear, I hear a song and I'll see a young kid enjoying it, and I say, okay, wow, this person, and I have to catch with something. Wow, this person wasn't even born when the song that's being sampled came out. As far as my allegiance to soul music, it's really, well, let me say this. Just about every group who I interviewed is in some capacity still performing.
Yeah.
And I think the reason they're able to do so is because the songs that they made popular, they're timeless classics. I mean, people remember the words of these songs. And there was a certain quality, a certain pureness about them. And that in itself speaks to my love for this music. A lot of these artists out now, I don't know if they can sing these songs 20 years from now on the club circuit. Mm-hmm. Although I will say that I also have a great love of, 70s soft rock, like Elton John and those guys, Chicago. Dare I say, even ABBA. I really enjoy. I enjoyed Doobie Brothers. I enjoyed that also.
I think ABBA fans have long since come out of the closet as it's actually cool to like ABBA now, especially with that Mamma Mia musical that came out a few years ago. Yeah.
Well, just before we end the segment, you mentioned the longevity, and I was surprised that you had the Isley Brothers in your books there, because my God, when I think the Isley Brothers, I go back to the 50s, and yet. They're still on. I mean, they must have a record. I mean, have they charted in like every decade?
Yeah. In fact, they had what was it? I think summer of 2001, they had an album that went to #1 or top 5 very briefly. So they have charted in every decade. Yeah.
Wow, that's remarkable. Is it the same crew, or have they changed?
Right now, they're just 2 of them. Ronald Isley, who's always been the lead singer,
right,
and one of his younger brothers.
Okay.
Ronald Isley's become like I guess you could say, an icon to a lot of the popular R&B artists who are out now. R. Kelly in particular, who's kind of kept him alive. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of the same thing in the early '90s with Barry White when Lisa Stansfield came out. And also Soul to Soul, the 2 European acts. All of a sudden, Barry White was popular again.
Right.
Lisa Stansfield, I mean, when she had hit records, she publicly acknowledged Barry White as a big influence, and that made him popular again.
And then Ally McBeal came along.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, Mark, we're going to take a break and listen to another soul song, and when we get back, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about your 2 books. So let's listen to another classic soul song.
Okay, great. Okay,
we're back with Marc Taylor talking about his 2 two books, Touch of Classic Soul, Soul Singers of the Early 70s and also of the Late 70s, Volume 2, and also his website is www.touchofclassicsoul.com. And we've listened to a couple of songs, and in perusing the two books, Mark, you have probably in total about close to 70 artists, and I had mentioned that I knew probably some of the bigger name artists, and which artists were the most helpful in compiling the books, and which were a bit more snooty and condescending?
Well, it's kind of it's funny. It was really a rude awakening because a lot of the artists whose music I admired from the time I was 3 or 4 years old, some of them weren't. It was kind of a rude awakening once I met them, and it was the complete opposite. Some artists whose music I really wasn't all that crazy about turned out to be really great people. Right off the bat, I would have to say that easily the nicest person was Kathy Sledge, who was the lead singer of Sister Sledge.
Yeah.
We Are Family, and others in the industry have said that about her. That before you even talk about her as a performer, it's like, oh, she's a wonderful person. So she stands out at the top of my list.
It's interesting because that song "We Are Family" that is probably the one that still she's probably best known for is become this iconic song at practically every diversity gathering, regardless of whether it's racial diversity or sexual diversity or just a rainbow family kind of stuff. You hear that song still going on all the time.
Right.
It's become this like emblematic song.
Well, same thing with Gloria Gaynor's "I Will Survive."
Yes, right. Same thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering too, Mark, do you think, now, since you didn't have any publishing pressure, since it's self-published, is there anything you would have done different? Would you would like to have focused more in depth on certain artists or had more artists included? Because, like I said, you have 70 or so artists. Do you think the books would have been better as you look back if you only did maybe 30 artists but more in depth, or done 100 with less? Or do you think you hit it right?
Well, it's funny. People come up to me all the time, and particularly when it was just the first book. And I was like, how come you didn't have this one? How come you didn't have that one? And in some cases, well, how come you were focused solely on the music and didn't get so personal? It's asking a lot for somebody to sit for a half hour, 45 minutes, or however lengthy their career was to tell you about their career for free, actually, put it in a book. In some cases, I didn't get too personal unless it had something to do with the music. And maybe I just didn't know how to handle it, but for instance, Bobby Womack, who had numerous ups and downs in his career, and I knew it was substance abuse related, and so I had to touch on it, and thankfully he was very, very open about it. I mean, a bit too open, but he was very open about it.
And actually, you had sent me that, and when the show is online, people can read that section from, which book is that, number 1 or 2?
The first one.
The first one, online at the Omniversica companion page. But continue.
So it's you have to cut it off someplace, or else you have a 1,000-page book. Because I would even run into somebody who may have had an obscure song out that got played on the radio 4 or 5 times, and that was it. And I was like, okay, well, how come I wasn't in your book? So you really do have to cut it off somewhere. So there are some people who I missed. Some cases, artists just didn't want to be bothered or didn't respond to numerous requests. And I was like, oh, well, I kind of regret it. But
and those you just did sort of bios about.
Yeah. Those. There are some who for whatever reason couldn't make themselves available. And I just had to write a bio on it. They were just too big to leave out. And
right.
You have some mid-level or obscure people who, had I been able to run down for an interview, I would have put them in, but it didn't turn out that way. And really, and nobody has asked, how come so and so, or not this one or that one.
Yeah. Now, in the 70s, I was not a disco fan, but I liked funk because funk to me was sort of the sort of black equivalent of hard rock music, or today, sort of gangster rap. And I know, you profile in book 2 George Clinton here, and you have an anecdote about how he went from being a doo-wop singer to being the Grand Master. You want to relate that?
And it's funny how you mentioned it's equivalent to rock, because that's really how he just fell into it. Throughout the 50s and 60s, he was a doo-wop singer and really didn't have much success. I mean, he was numerous bands, numerous singles, and none made any noise. And he just started hanging out with acid rock artists. And I think he was on the he was the opening act for for several popular rock bands in the late 60s, and he just he saw the enormous audience reaction to these songs that they were playing, and it was like comparing apples and oranges to the lukewarm response that he got for his spotty career up to that point. And he just pulled a little bit from here, a little bit from there, and he kind of lucked into getting some very good musicians. One, Bernie Worrell, who stands out as the whole Parliament Funkadelic umbrella.
And he had a brilliant career with many producers and rock bands later too.
Yeah.
Not excluding the Talking Heads, for example.
Okay. Yeah, and really, he just really slowly. First, he built kind of like a cult following, up until maybe 75. And in 1976, he had a huge song, Tear the Roof Off the Sucker, which really made him a bit more mainstream. That's when everybody started paying attention to P-Funk, and it just took off from there.
Yeah, and I know another artist from the 70s that stood out to me always was Isaac Hayes, and in reading your going through him, it's interesting too how he reworked a lot of those Burt Bacharach kind of Dionne Warwick type songs and just went off into totally different directions.
Right. Now, if you listen to the Dionne Warwick version of Walk On By and his version, it's two completely different songs, and in a sense, he kind of fell into it also because the label he was with, Stax, they had put a quota on a number of albums they needed at a certain point, and they came up one short. So they said, "Okay, Isaac, go ahead and just give us an album. You can do whatever you want to."
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And what he wanted, and that's how he was able to come up with what was unheard of, because at that time, songs were just 3 minutes for radio play. And he took Walk On By and stretched it into, I think, 11 minutes. And Glenn Campbell's By the Time I Get to Phoenix, that song's almost 20 minutes long. It's about 11 minutes before he actually starts singing. And that just really opened up a whole area for other artists who had these long, lengthy songs and were afraid to push them because they said, well, we're not going to get this played on the air because it's longer than 3 minutes.
Do you think that Isaac's doing that, since he was giving free reign, was maybe one of the instigators of the whole dance remix thing with the extended grooves that, I mean, we're all used to 45-minute club mixes now sometimes of soul songs, of pop songs, of even some rap, but more of techno and that kind of thing. Do you think there's an ancestral connection there?
I think so, and ancestral is the right word. I mean, I don't think anybody. I think perhaps it's subconscious that it just evolved from Isaac Hayes in 1969, 1970, when he first introduced these lengthy songs to, and then Barry White started having lengthy songs, and that kind of took us into the disco era.
Right.
And now you have all these, like you said, extended versions. It just took off. It just evolved from Isaac Hayes.
And I know that Art is going to be talking later on with a jazz critic named Robert Levin about, and probably mentioning something a little bit he was saying about John Cage doing, and it seems to me that Hayes is sort of the soul version to some extent of that, just taking something and running with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and being very experimental I mean, Hayes actually contributed a lot to movie music too. I mean, with the whole Shaft phenomenon when he did the soundtrack for the Gordon Parks movie and all that. So.
Right. Yeah, the music of that movie was as much responsible for the success as the movie itself. And
right. Exactly.
That opened the door for others to do the same thing during that whole quote-unquote blaxploitation era.
Right.
Some were good.
A lot were not so good. But
yeah.
But that made some people's careers too. And
sure.
It's always interesting to me when you go back and you listen to the theme from Shaft. Here's the theme song for a movie. It's not a 1 minute or a 2 minute piece. It's long.
Right.
Again, Isaac doing the long extended thing. So
exactly. Yeah.
Now I want to read a short section from Marc's book. It's from a chapter on the chairman of the board, and that's a group that I'm just vaguely familiar with, but I found it interesting. And I want to read the excerpt, and then we're going to listen to another song, and then when I get back, we'll have Marc comment on it, and we'll also talk about the place of religion in soul music. But this was an interesting quote, and it's from General Johnson, who was the lead singer of that group, the chairman of the board, and he says, "When you hear Carolina beach music, you're talking about black soul music. This is strange. This is how things change. I'm singing soulful music, but I haven't sung for a black audience in 12 years. That tells you something. It's like everybody else, or everything else. What blacks do, we forget about it, and nobody writes about the history of it. And as time goes by, it becomes other people's music. That's the problem with our youth today. They don't know where they came from. If it's not written so they can read it, they really would think that Elvis Presley was the first rock and roll singer. I'm not just confining it to music, it's whatever. There's not enough history of what we do. I hate it because we have so many great artists who nobody remembers, great artists." And that again brings us back to the idea too of race. And I want to, when we get back, Marc, talk a little bit about the place that race in America has to do with soul music, and also religion in soul music. But we'll let you think on that a minute or two, and we're going to listen to another great soul song.
Okay.
All right, we're back with Marc Taylor. Speaking of 1970s soul music, he has a website called www.touchofclassicsoul.com. Check it out. Check out some of his books. Maybe order a few and put some money in his coffers. Anyway, we left the last segment, Art. I read a section from the lead singer of a group called the Chairman of the Board about basically almost how the black public tends to sort of discard their heroes, and I was just wondering, did you find that was a prevalent theme? Did he say that was some bitterness? Did you find some bitterness in some of the artists?
Yeah, definitely, and I think you look no further. Recently, PBS has had a couple of, I guess you could say, oldies but goodies shows, and most of the artists were predominantly black artists from the 60s and 70s. But when they showed the audience, you saw very few black people in there, and I don't think it's just a matter of economics. I think blacks do have a tendency. It's a "what have you done lately" thing, and you can have your heyday may last 4 or 5 years. You may be the biggest thing out there, but after 4 or 5 years, once your career goes into a downward spiral, you're over forgotten about. You consider played out.
Yeah, and I was just that brings in mind another anecdote from the second book with the disco group Chic, where they seem to the track is called "My Forbidden Lover," and apparently they felt there was some backlash where the industry was sort of blackballed them, and I don't know.
Well, they "My Forbidden Lover" followed their big hit "Good Times."
Right.
And Good Times peaked. It was like the song of the summer of '79. At least here in New York it was. And Good Times peaked. And right after that, the whole quote-unquote disco sucks thing came in. And, the whole thing with the breaking records at Comiskey Park and everything. And by the time they got around to releasing My Forbidden Lover, it got a lot of airplay in New York, but again, that's where Chic was based, so that's going to happen anyway. But nationally, it didn't do that well. And Nile Rodgers, the Chic person from Chic who I spoke with, he actually liked that song better. I, as a fan, did also. I don't know if that was just a matter of I got tired of hearing Good Times so often, but...
Or was it just a musically better song, you think? Or it's hard to say, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think what it was, and especially that they played Good Times so much
Yeah, true.
that you just got tired of hearing it. But you still like that Chic sound. So when they released the second single, my split was like, okay, it's not Good Times, thank God, but it's still Chic, so I can get into this. And really right out of Chic, and also Sister Sledge, their second album, which again was produced by Chic, didn't do nearly as well as the We Are Family album. And again, that was just out of nowhere. It just came the whole anti-disco backlash. So it wasn't necessarily Chic getting blackballed. Really, disco got blackballed. KC the Sunshine Band, they just completely vanished. And if you weren't able to change with the times, your career was gone.
Now let's talk about a religion, the place that it plays in soul music, and generally, I would say most people would probably agree that in quote white music, it doesn't play as big a role. Now I know a lot of big R&B soul stars, later became preachers or became born again, and the two most prominent from the '70s that in your two books that stood out were two big superstars, Al Green and Donna Summer.
Right.
What basically do you think precipitated that in both of them? Was it just trying to sell to a particular audience, or did they have some terrible thing happen to them?
Well, in the case of Al Green, at the height of his career, a lady that he was involved with, she was, I think she had a mental problem, but what happened? She asked him to marry her, and he turned her down, and while he was taking a shower, she threw grits, or supposedly grits, or some kind of oatmeal on him, and he suffered, severe burns throughout his body. And right after that, that was like his awakening. Now, he has always denied it, saying that his spiritual awakening happened a year earlier. But prior to that tragic incident, all of his songs were strictly secular, and then he just completely went to the opposite extreme. So it's like, despite what he says, it's use your common sense.
Now with Donna Summer, in reading your book, I know she was. What was the song where she's sort of orgasmically grunting?
Love to Love You, Baby.
Yeah. And she, I'll tell you, she was one of those that I remember in the '70s having the Velvet Donna Summer posters, and she was like, she was sort of in a sense the Black Pharaoh with her hair, and Farrah Fawcett with that poster, and now she resented that even before she had her conversion.
Yeah, she grew up singing gospel, and amongst many of the superstars of the disco era, Donna Summer can actually sing.
Right.
She grew up singing gospel, and she was in Broadway plays here and abroad. So
and she was didn't she in your book, didn't she do like hair, or was it what?
Yeah, right. She did hair.
Yeah.
And so that whole thing of just the whole image, disco image of this sex goddess, which was strictly an image, just to sell it back, 'cause she wasn't really comfortable with it. And the song "Love to Love You, Baby," her and her producers, they really did it kind of as an afterthought. And it just the whole idea of it being completely different from anything being played on the radio at the time.
Well, I know that Al Green charted in the '80s in the gospel music, and he some people probably know him more for that. Was Donna Summer as successful or not?
Not at all. No. Donna Summer would remain. Her career in the '80s was kind of spotty, but it was still strictly pop oriented. I guess her biggest hit in the '80s was "She Works Hard for the Money." But her songs were for the most part aimed at the pop audience. It was just kind of hit and miss, and she was kind of quiet until the whole until disco got popular again.
You know, in looking at that quote that General Johnson spoke, there's a whole history of white artists sort of co-opting black music, from Elvis Presley to Eminem, and you mentioned Casey and the Sunshine Band. Is there a lot of resentment, do you think, in a lot of the black artists that you interviewed against sort of white artists in the soul or the disco scene, or was that something that basically is overblown?
I think it's overblown. I think it's overblown through the media. And those who I interviewed, they're only ones who they really expressed any bitterness about. What that stands out to me was Milli Vanilli.
Really?
And I guess their attitude is, it's like, well, we had our day, and whatever new technology or gimmicks can enhance your voice to make it appear that you can really sing, as opposed to the 50s, 60s, 70s where you actually did have to have singing talent. Now it's all about the visual and how you look, and they can use whatever technology to enhance your voice. They say, okay, well, that's fine. That's just the way, that's just a sign of the times. That's just the way things are now. However, when you give a Grammy to a act who, it's not using your voice at all, that's, they had a problem with that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people did, actually.
Yeah.
Speaking of pop stuff, have you? I saw Lionel Richie the other day on American Idol, the TV show, with the singing contestants, and have you ever watched that show, the American Idol?
On occasion, yes.
Yeah. Anyway, wanted to end up this interview with you just asking, you got 2 books now that you've written about soul music. What are your plans in the future? I mean, are you going to end up doing like a definitive encyclopedia? Do you write any creative fiction, novels or anything in the work?
I think I'm going to stay into the popular music or history of popular music genre. A couple of people have talked to me about, they have some manuscript on Jimi Hendrix, so I'll take a look at that. Prince's sister has written, she's doing a manuscript, she wants me to take a look at that. So, and one of the Crystals, you remember the 60s group, the Crystals?
I remember.
Okay, what a bit is. He's a rebel, the dude out of Run. The lead singer, she's thinking about doing a manuscript, particularly in light of what happened with Phil Spector.
So you would ghostwrite them?
I would perhaps.
That's a way to get some money.
Ghostwrite and publish it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So right now I'm still busy with these 2. Thankfully I've written about a subject where it's a timeless subject, so sales are still pretty good.
Well, I think it's good to know this subject too, because it's like you were saying before, there is a tendency to dismiss the history of what comes before, and I think there's a lot of musicians these days who could stand to have a sense of their ancestral roots.
Yeah.
Well, Marc, let me just give you a website again. It's www.touchofclassicsoul.com, and anyone who's enjoyed any of the songs that they've heard on this hour can go to Marc's website and give him a little business. And Marc, just want to say thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thank you.
And hopefully you'll have continued success in whatever ventures you have. And we're going to listen to another classic soul song, and when we get back, Art Durkee is going to be engaged in conversation with a fellow named Robert Levin and talking about jazz. So, Marc, you might want to listen to that too when you get a chance.
Okay.
All right. Take care, Marc.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, we're back, and we're switching gears here from soul music to jazz, and I don't know a goddamn thing about jazz, other than that my parents like swing music. But anyway, we're here with Bob Levin. He is a critic of jazz, and basically most of this hour we're going to turn it over to Art Durkee. But before we do so, we want to welcome Bob. Bob?
Thank you.
Welcome aboard.
And Bob actually is going to kick things off with an essay basically telling us what he and Art are going to discuss. So I'll turn it over to you, Bob.
Okay, I put together some quick preliminary notes to kick this off with, and I'll read from them. More or less officially unveiled with the first New York appearance of the Ornette Coleman Quartet at the Five Spot Cafe in the fall of 1959. Free jazz or new black music, space music, new thing, anti-jazz, abstract jazz, or Greenwich Village jazz, as it would variously be identified, gave a new dimension to the perennial "where's the melody" complaint against jazz. Certainly for most of the uninitiated, what the Coleman Group presented on its opening night was, to say the least, perplexing. 4 musicians, a saxophonist, trumpeter, bassist, and drummer, abruptly began to play with an apoplectic intensity and at a bone-rattling volume. 4 simultaneous solos that had no perceptible shared references or point of departure. Even unto themselves, these solos, to the extent that they could be isolated as such in the density of sound that was being produced, were without any fixed melodic or rhythmic structure, consisting by turns of short, jagged bursts and long, meandering lines, unmindful of bar divisions and chorus measures. They were, moreover, laced by the horn players with strident honks, squeaks, bleats, and squeals. A number ended and another began, or was it the same one again? How are you to know? Umbilically connected to the emergent black cultural nationalism movement, the madness, for all of its dismaying impenetrability, did indeed have a method. An avowed objective of the dramatic innovations that musicians like Ornette, Cecil Taylor, the later period John Coltrane, and in their immediate footsteps Sonny Murray, Archie Shepp, Albert Ayler, Jimmy Lyons, Andrew Cyrille, Eric Dolphy, and Don Cherry, among hundreds of others, initiated and developed from the late 50s to the early 70s, was to restore black music to its original function as a music of spiritual utility. When these men abandoned an adherence to chord progressions, the 32-bar song form, the fixed beat, and the soloist accompanist format, and began to experiment with, among other things, simultaneous improvisations, fragmented tempos, and voice-like timbres, they were very deliberately replacing with ancient black methodologies those Western concepts and systems that had, by their lights, worked to subvert and reduce black music in America, not just to a pop music, but, and this was considered no less a corruption of what black music was supposed to be, an art form. Alan Silva, a one-time bass player with Cecil Taylor and then the leader of his own 13-piece orchestra, made the point in an interview I did with him in 1970. I don't want to make music that sounds nice, Silva told me. I want to make music that opens the possibility of real spiritual communion between people. There's a flow coming from every individual, a continuous flow of energy coming from the subconscious level. The idea is to tap that energy through the medium of improvised sound. I start from the point of view that if you put 13 musicians together and they all play at once, eventually a cohesion and order will be reached, and that order will occur on the deepest of levels. Of course, not all of these musicians' work fit perfectly into Silva's explanation. Some, like Taylor, for example, did and quite emphatically regard themselves as artists. And for Taylor, who took what he needed not just from Ellington and Monk, but from Stravinsky, Ives, and Bartok, it wasn't about rejecting Western influences on jazz, but about subsuming them into a specifically black identity and aesthetic. For the most part, however, disparities among the younger musicians of the period amounted to dialects of the same language. Most all of them shared the new black consciousness of the period, a new pride in being black. And their reconstruction of jazz, their purging of its Western elements, or their assertion of black authority over those elements, was to one degree or another intended to revive the atavistic in the music. Silva saw grand extra-musical ramifications in his procedures. He believed that by jettisoning externally imposed and introjected constraints, the inherent goodness in men would surface and enable them to function in absolute harmony with both nature and each other. Man, he said to me once coming off a set, in another 10 years we won't even need traffic lights. We're going to be so spiritually attuned to one another. And I thought he might be right. This was, after all, a delirious time, a period in history when restrictions and constraints of every conceivable kind, from social mores to the very law of gravity, were being successfully challenged and defied. Certainly, if you were visiting Timothy Leary's atomic level of consciousness on a regular basis, and if you could call a girl you'd been set up with on a blind date and she might say, "Let's ball first, and then I'll see if I want to have dinner with you," you could be forgiven the belief that nothing short of a revolution in human nature itself was taking place. And some of us who regarded Western values as the principal obstacle to such a transformation, had they not brought us to the brink of annihilation with the hydrogen bomb, saw the new black music as leading the way, as the veritable embodiment of what Herbert Marcuse called the revolution of unrepression. As I say, it was an intoxicating time. You could in this period actually engage in earnest debates about the relative revolutionary significance of rock and this new black music. I remember an exchange I had with John Sinclair, the Michigan activist, poet, and author of Guitar Army. John took the position that rock was the music of the revolution. No, I argued, rock did take a stand against the technocratic Faustian Western sensibility. It did, and unabashedly, celebrate the sensual and the mystical. But in these respects, it only caught up to where jazz had always been. In contrast to what some of the younger black musicians were up to, the purging of white elements African music had picked up in America, rock music was merely the first hip white popular music. Rock, it was my point, never got beyond expressing the sentiment of revolution, while free jazz, by breaking with formal Western disciplines, by going outside, as the musicians termed it, of Western procedures and methodologies, and letting the music find its own natural order and form, got to an actualization of what true revolution would be. Rock lyrics promoted in many instances the idea of a spiritual revolution, but musically, rock remained bound to the very traditions and conventions which its lyrics railed against, and the audience never got a demonstration or the experience of spiritual communion. Rock lyrics were subverted in the very act of their expression by the system used to express them. Free jazz, on the other hand, achieved freedom not just from the purely formal structures of Western musical systems, but implicitly from the emotional and social ethos in which those structures originated. Some 30 to 40 years later, free jazz in anything resembling a pristine form hardly exists, and it would not be inaccurate to describe many of the recordings that have survived from the 60s and 70s as mere artifacts of a failed revolution. But free jazz has not been without impact and influence. Certainly on purely musical terms, it increased the vocabulary and options available to mainstream jazz musicians. And while men like Taylor and Ornette function now in what amounts to their own universes, they continue to discover the marvelous in their work. Indeed, Taylor's recent performances with drummers like Max Roach, what he would call exchanges of energy, have been a stunning case in point. That jazz will continue to evolve is somewhat in question at this stage. We can discuss some of the reasons for this. But if it does get moving again, the contributions of musicians like these will surely have to be dealt with.
Okay. We've been listening to Bob Levin with some notes about free jazz, its origins, history, and current impact. And we're going to listen to some of this music right now. I believe we're going to listen to some of the album-length piece Ascension by John Coltrane, and then we'll come back in a minute. And we're back with Bob Levin talking about free jazz, the revolutionary jazz music of the 60s and 70s. You spoke earlier about this whole spiritual thrust of the music. I had not considered that in the past when I've thought about free jazz to be so central, but from what you're telling me, from the interviews with some of the musicians that you've done, that was very much a part of it. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, obviously certain of them were more secular than others, but they all shared that spiritual dimension, that concern with spirituality. That was a very prominent aspect of the music.
I'm thinking in part of late Coltrane when he was very overtly pursuing a spiritual agenda, as he put it, through the music. Somebody asked him, well, now that you've accomplished this, what do you want to do next? And his reply was, I want to become a saint.
And he did. Coltrane was an interesting figure in that period because he wasn't... Well, I like what Leroy Jones said about him, Amiri Baraka, that Ornette and Cecil were proceeding as though Coltrane had already completed his work. What he meant by that was that before those later free jazz records that Coltrane made, he was actually exploding bebop going to its outer limits, expanding it as much as it was capable of being expanded, and finishing it, kind of assassinating it, so that the revolutionaries could take over. That's how we thought in those days.
It's interesting because I've had an argument at least a couple times with musicians who would consider themselves jazz musicians that late Coltrane, Cecil Taylor, big chunks of Ornette's music should not be called jazz. I don't know what they would call it. That wasn't clear to me, but I've heard one jazz musician talk about a piece like Ascension as basically, well, it sounds like an orchestra tuning up to me. Is that? Can you follow up on that idea a little bit about Coltrane's exploding?
I think an artist decides how to define what he's doing. Cecil, for example, regarded himself as a jazz musician, and therefore, by his definition, what he played was jazz. I think that you have to give that a certain credibility. You have to give the artist. You have to use the artist's definition.
Okay.
Jazz has always reflected where the black man is in America, and that's where the black man was at that particular point.
That actually leads into something else I wanted to ask about. I've read and heard that some of the impetus behind the free jazz movement was a form of response to more or less the white co-optation and white artists taking over the jazz mainstream in the 50s and 60s. I mean, was this an Afrocentric response in some ways?
Yeah.
Okay.
But every radical change in jazz was about that. It was about wresting the music away from white people.
So that was true of Parker and Gillespie when they
Sure,
did.
bebop was all about that, or at least one.
So that's
a dimension of it was.
So that's a cyclic process.
It was. I mean, whether it will continue to be remains to be seen.
Do you feel like, I mean, because of this cyclic process, or whether or not it remains to be seen in the future, is there anything even remotely like this free jazz revolution going on in jazz today?
No.
No?
I think that's partially due. Well, there are several reasons for that. I think the place of the black man in America at this point is not clear, maybe even to black people, and that would be one reason why jazz is kind of stalled at this point. In a more practical sense, the Marcellus, when Marcellus Mafia at Lincoln Center has played an important role in discouraging people from experimenting, innovating.
Yeah.
By calling what they do not jazz and locking them out of Lincoln Center.
So it's either you're black classical music and you agree with Winton, or you're not jazz.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a real problem. I've heard some people talk about rap as the substitute black revolution for the cyclic of black response to white co-optation of American pop music. Does that fit at all? I mean, I've
the same dynamic is operating.
Okay.
Although I would put rap largely, with the exception of maybe two or three artists, genuine artists in that category. I would put that in the category of pop music. Who
would those two or three be, out of curiosity?
Now you're going to force me to think.
Yeah, we ask the tough questions.
You sure do. I can't think of anybody offhand.
Okay.
There are a lot of names floating by, but nobody I'd want to pick for sure.
Bob, this is Dan. I just had listening to you and Art talk here, I just had sort of a lay idea. You mentioned that jazz is whatever the jazz man wants to call it, but as a poet, that kind of really is like fingernails on a chalkboard, because I mean there's so much shit poetry that's written that's basically prose broken into lines, and you can call it poetry, but I'll call it toilet paper. I mean, there has to be something that a jazz person, some jazz aficionado is going to say, now that's jazz and that's bullshit. And, there has to be a bit of a hard definition, isn't there?
Well, that's... how can I answer that? I think, again, that most of everything is bullshit.
Yeah.
And, we're talking about really talented, intelligent men who may have been naive, given the period they existed in, but who had who understood the jazz tradition, who came from it. As difficult as that may be to hear in Cecil's work, for example, it's all about Monk and Ellington.
Okay.
And it goes back beyond that, the stride pianist. I mean, he is an extension of that. It's part of that continuum. If you're willing, to listen. I know he's difficult.
Yeah. Is there a, there's in some forms of jazz that predate the explosion of free jazz, in terms of the song structure and the form, there are elements of blues progressions, 12-bar forms, 8-bar forms. Did any of that linger in with Taylor's music too?
I think it's in Taylor's music. It's buried in Taylor's music.
Okay.
Someone like Albert Ayler, however,
right.
I remember the first time that I heard him, he had the biggest sound that I ever heard, and was really all about Earl Bostic and a lot of the honkers and shouters. See, all these guys did have a sense of what had come before them and an enormous respect for it. And when they made a break with it, it was a respectful break. I remember some of them talking about how if Bird had really let himself go, the revolution would have taken place years before. But they still respected and understood what had happened. Certainly Cecil was very cognizant of the tradition, and I think Ornette was too.
Well,
and Coltrane obviously was.
Yeah. How much of the experimentation of free jazz was tied to certain urban centers, though? And the reason I ask that is because when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I was like musically dead center between Detroit and Chicago.
Right.
And I remember being in college and just blown away by going and seeing people like the Art Ensemble of Chicago, Ronald Shannon Jackson, various other AACM groups, Griot Galaxy,
right.
In Detroit. And it seemed to me that there was a lot of exchange going on there. So when we talk about Ornette and Coltrane and Cecil Taylor, a lot of those are East Coast figures, but wasn't this really a nationwide kind of thing?
Well, actually, Ornette was from Texas.
Right, okay, Texas,
and, he was actually known before he got here. I think he made a record before he got
here.
Okay. The guys you're talking about were what I would consider to be third generation avant-garde musicians.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, they followed. If you use Cecil, Ornette, and Coltrane as the starting point, and then you start talking about the people they played with, younger musicians who learned from them and who eventually went out on their own. The AACM people followed that. They may have been, for all I know, they may have been functioning simultaneously, but my impression at the time was that these were still another group of cats who were coming up.
Okay. Where would Sun Ra fit into this then, if at all?
Sun Ra's principal contribution, I think, was in some of the players like John Gilmore, who's a pretty terrific tenor saxophone player. I don't think Sun Ra was taken especially seriously by most of the other musicians.
I'm not sure he's taken seriously even today, even though he made some amazing music.
He did. I mean, that was an interesting band. It wasn't a Mickey Mouse band, but
yeah.
It was mostly for the musicians who passed through his band that his contribution was made.
Okay. Can you said something earlier about the whole idea of Well, to get back to the spiritual thrust, almost religious aspect of this music that I find so intriguing, you said something earlier about how rock and roll actually was approaching where free jazz wanted to go, but didn't quite succeed. Now, I know a lot of people who would say that they've gone to rock concerts. I know people who were at, Doors concerts in the 60s, and they saw Jimi Hendrix and that sort of thing, and there was a spiritual communion there that they claimed. I wonder if there's really a distinction there or not.
Well, I think the distinction would be like the distinction between speed and energy. By speed, I mean drugs.
Right, okay.
You can arrive at all kinds of spiritual epiphanies on drugs. They're not necessarily authentic, even if they're experienced that way. Certainly at the time, I thought that what was happening in jazz was closer to something authentic.
A little more pure?
Yeah, pure. Fine.
But wasn't there a lot of drug usage in the jazz circles at this time, too?
Not really at that point. Actually, there was... if bebop was all about heroin, the musicians during that period, actually I don't remember any of them specifically being strung out on heroin. Cocaine was coming into fashion, but that was enough. It wasn't. Cocaine isn't necessarily associated with spiritual experience, but it is. It is lifting. It
makes you play fast.
Yeah.
I think that we will take a pause now and listen to some more music and some more free jazz, and we will come back and talk. And we're back talking with Bob Levin, jazz historian and writer. We're talking about free jazz, the explosion of new forms or lack of forms in jazz music in the late 60s, early 70s. Bob, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is I think there was parallels to what was going on in free jazz and some of the other arts, including other areas of music. I'm thinking in particular of the whole revolution that John Cage and his followers like Christian Wolff, David Tudor sort of spawned within the classical music realms, where they took the whole concert hall and turned it into an improvised performance, and that sort of thing.
Right.
Do you see a parallel there at all, or?
I see a superficial parallel.
Okay.
A lot of things were happening simultaneously during that period. There was extraordinary pullulation of art, poetry, dance, theater, especially on the Lower East Side, where a lot of these things that I'm talking about originated. Everybody was breaking down structures. And if you think about it, that's really, in essence, what the 60s was about. It was about breaking down all manner of externally imposed authority.
Social, musical.
Well, social, internalized mores, virtually everything. And what was happening in white or European-informed avant-garde music, to me, was largely cerebral and conceptual. Whereas free jazz was very specifically an emotive music. Actually, I got a quote from that same interview I did with Alan Silva, where he was talking about Stockhausen. I read an interview with Stockhausen recently. He was rapping about spirituality in his music and coming on very strong about it. But man, I've heard Stockhausen's music. I saw him in Europe. He sits with this Moog synthesizer and controls everything. Sits there, man, playing with dials and making sure nothing will get too far out of hand. Now, you're never going to get to the spirits by controlling everything. Exactly where Stockhausen is at was revealed when the interviewer asked him what he thought of free jazz. Stockhausen said he couldn't relate to it, that to him it was just uncontrolled energy and bedlam. Now dig it, man. Here's a cat who's mathematized and theorized his entire existence. he couldn't possibly see uncontrolled energy as beautiful. The tradition he comes out of and what he refuses to let go of make it impossible for him to let go in his music. I think that pretty much covers the people you're talking about. They were looking for intellectual epiphanies, and the jazz musicians of that particular period were, again, into an emotive music.
Well, it strikes me then that there's a connection between the abstract expressionist art movement that was going on at the same time, especially after World War II, when the center of the art world moved over to New York from Paris. A lot of these, well, frankly, fairly macho white guys like Jackson Pollock, Bill de Kooning, Bob Rauschenberg, and those guys were doing very expressionistic and, according to some people, some very emotive work. Is that where maybe the white emotion came out?
You know, I'm painting everything in a very general way.
Yeah.
Every rule has its exception, you know, in this context. I think that largely, I mean, to make a distinction between what they were up to and what the jazz musicians of the period were up to, was largely, I mean, Cage and those people were into something conceptual, which was fine. If you understood it, you didn't go to a Cage concert to hear beautiful music. You went there to experience an idea.
I just wonder if there was, it sounds like there was no particular, I mean, obviously the jazz musicians knew about Stockhausen and Cage, but I wonder
most of them did.
Yeah, I wonder if any of the people like Stockhausen and Cage and Earl Brown knew about the jazz musicians and what they were doing.
I think they must have been aware of them.
Okay.
Whether they, you know, and they probably used elements that they could, but they brought it back into a very specifically Western sensibility.
Now, if I could just ask a sort of a lay question, I can see some maybe connections just between jazz and maybe a Pollock or a Piet Mondrian, but it's hard for me to, just as a layperson, to try to connect. Who's the fellow? Is it Rauschenberg who has like the all singular color paintings or half? You know, is that Rauschenberg or de Kooning?
Motherwell, Robert Motherwell did the white and black paintings.
Rothko, that's what
Rothko
Marc
did.
Rothko.
Yeah, the color fields.
I'm just wondering, those kinds of paintings seem so goddamn mellow to the point of almost, for me, being narcoleptic. And whereas jazz seems to be the antithesis. I can see a Pollock being there, but you know, it seems almost like, you know, to say like abstract expression, are you talking ideas that there's some connection, or because it would seem emotively speaking, they can go in a hell of a lot of different places.
Well, I don't want to get too far afield, but I think that you see it in you know, the overview that I would have of all this is that we were confronted with absolute total annihilation. I mean, that whole period really was a reaction to the hydrogen bomb and the Holocaust, you know, World War II, and all those things. And I think that what basically was operating with everybody on one level or another, and in one way or another, was a kind of belief that if we break down, again, externally imposed forms of authority that are unnatural, that are artificial, they're what's wrong. If we break them down, if we get rid of them, if we allow ourselves to emerge. I mean, one thing about the 60s that nobody seems to mention is the influence that psychoanalysis had on it, because the Freudian vogue that took place in the 50s, and which reminded you that your parents were at fault, you know, the most immediate forms of authority, certainly played a role. That's where Jerry Rubin got the line, "Kill your parents." It was, you know what I'm saying? There were all these factors, you know, from contraception to Freudian analysis, to the moonshot. I mean, all these things were playing a role, and I think the moonshot was probably the most significant aspect of that, because we really were challenging something as fundamental as the law of gravity. And I think what ultimately happened was that, the Kramers, there was no monolith on the moon. There was nothing that, we got to the moon and it was a desert.
Right.
And I think that's what ultimately took the heart out of the 60s.
Okay.
We were looking for God, we were looking for answers, and they weren't there. And we didn't, we had nothing to recharge ourselves with to keep going.
One of the things that critics of free jazz have often talked about is the fact that it all sounds like random noodling. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, but there is a certain amount of, if you play Drop the Needle on, album X and album Y, there's going to be a certain amount of that. How relevant is that to the fact that, I'm not relevant, but how related is that to the fact that the whole culture was exploding? I mean, was it like everybody was having the same idea at the same time to break out of the old structures? Because there's a difference, I think, between finding a personal expression and expressing yourself versus, hey, everybody do your own thing, but then you all end up looking or sounding the same. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, we are talking about a failed revolution, but it didn't happen. It didn't. What we had hoped for never materialized. Mm-hmm. It never materialized because restraints, it turns out, are necessary.
Okay.
You can't let it all hang out.
Okay.
And I think everybody more or less arrived at a comparable conclusion. Beginning with the late 50s and into the Cuban Missile Crisis, all these things, those things were very pivotal in terms of scaring the shit out of everybody and forcing everyone to take on beliefs that might have been naive, but were, at least at the time anyway, sincere attempts to come to terms with what was happening and how to change it.
Well, if the revolution failed, then, I mean, how did it fail? When did people decide that this wasn't going to work? Because I still hear, Ornette improvising the way he's always improvised, if not exactly with the same people or in the same way. And of course, Coltrane died fairly early, fairly young. Right. He did not really get a chance to fulfill what he was trying to do. I think he did, but I don't know that he would think he did. So is there a time or a place that we can pin down as the death of the revolution?
Well, I would I think the 60s expired in the deserts of the moon.
Okay.
Obviously I'm using that in a symbolic sense. You could say that there's another aspect was when the yippies tried to levitate the Pentagon. And, genuinely believed they were going to be able to do it. Levitate it and shake out the demons.
Yeah. So
when that didn't happen, all the visions turned out to be false. Mm-hmm. There was no incentive to go further. I mean, we were out of energy.
Well, and then people like Abby Hoffman went underground, and some of the silliness came out.
Well, the silliness was always there almost from day one, but I think what was happening on the Lower East Side, where most of the jazz that we're talking about emanated, was kind of the epicenter, as I see it. And people like Hoffman were kind of ripples.
Yeah, okay.
It's funny because that exchange that I described with John Sinclair, Abby Hoffman was there in the room when John and I were talking about the distinctions between rock and free jazz. And he and Jerry Rubin were in the room. Rubin was kind of a prickly guy who stayed out of it completely. Hoffman listened. And he understood what we were talking about, and he just sort of looked at me and said, I can't use that, and because that wasn't what he was about.
Right.
But the more profound aspects were that all this grew out of were pretty much left to the epicenter, which is,
right,
which I identify as Lower East Side. Obviously, that's
But it sounds then that like a lot of this was personality driven, and we had a particularly important time, but then there was also a particularly important group of people at the epicenter in that place and time, and maybe when they died or moved on, that was part of the death of the process?
Well, you could say that maybe some of them died because of the death of the process.
Okay.
I find it interesting that Kerouac died the same year as the Moonshot.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, in On the Road, which was a precursor to all this, the last lines where he talks about Dean Moriarty's father, the one that they were ostensibly looking for, which motivated their trips, and talks about he was the father that Dean had never known and who he'd always looked for. And Kerouac says, and I think of Dean, and I think of old Dean Moriarty, the father we never found. That struck me because he was already telling us what was going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, as we end this hour here, we've got a few more minutes. I wanted to just ask a couple of points. You mentioned Kerouac, and I've often thought that when I hear the word jazz appended to things like jazz poetry or jazz haiku or jazz this, jazz that, I often think, well, that has about as much relation to jazz as French fries do to France. And I wondered also too. You mentioned several times in the show, the revolution failed, the death of jazz, this, that, and another thing. And I'm wondering, just as a layperson, when I've read and I've had people over the years who love jazz, who've had me read a book or listen to an album, and one of the things when I've read jazz critics, there's a sort of haughtiness and a sense of almost defensiveness about this wonderful thing that they love. And I'm wondering if that's in part a reflection of this idea that you seem to be in sync with, that it's dead or it's failed or it's this or that, and wanting to hang on to something.
I think that for me, being involved with jazz, and I lived very tight with the music. I hung out with the musicians. It was my whole life was really involved with it, and I think it made me feel superior to my contemporaries who were listening to rock and roll. It made me stand off and apart from them and above them, and I probably played off that a lot. But is that what you're asking me?
Yeah,
I mean, that one of the questions?
Yeah, just basically, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that I know a lot of times there's this sort of cerebral aspect. We on our first hour we had a fellow named Marc Taylor talking about soul music, and that seemed to be more of an emotive thing, whereas jazz to me has always seemed to be more in the cranium. And again, I say that as someone who is really not that familiar with jazz, much less free jazz.
Okay. I've been defending jazz all my life, and I'm losing. I'm getting weary of that because I'm caring less about defending it. I think that I've stopped writing about it. One of the reasons I stopped writing about it was I felt that I'd said everything I had to say, but also because the music started to stop. It wasn't happening. A lot of these guys were like going to the coast.
It was
Quincy Jones was a great jazz musician at one time,
right,
until he went Hollywood.
Well, a lot of it went commercial, and the guys needed to make a living, I imagine. But as we wrap up here, I just wanted to underline one thing that I think you have talked about that it does impress me in that so many of these free jazz musicians were talking about the fact that their particular thing was an emotional thing versus a cerebral thing.
Right.
In terms of that, even though the free jazz playing style is part of the repertoire but not heard that often anymore, especially in these days of very commercialized light jazz or pop jazz.
Right.
Are there any musicians who are still carrying on at least the emotional aspects of that?
There probably are, and if there are, I'm not directly in touch.
Okay.
There's no one who stands out in my mind.
Yeah.
Of the younger people who might be
I think there are personally, but I think most of them are in Europe. There are people like Jan Garbarek and some of the, frankly, Northern European, specifically Scandinavian jazz musicians who are descendants of Coltrane and Taylor, and maybe it's that third or fourth generation thing going on now. I'm not sure.
Well, who knows? I mean, any one of those people could get this thing restarted. Jazz has always had an individual or a group of individuals periodically every 20 years or so who have surfaced and created a revolution.
Okay.
It could happen again, but everything is so dispersed at the moment that it's really difficult to get a handle on what could possibly happen.
And we may not know because it could be happening. We may just not know about it yet, too.
Of course.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
We've been talking to Bob Levin for the last hour about free jazz, its motivations, and some of the history. And thank you very much for doing this.
And just to let people who are listening, our next few shows are going to be interesting and a little bit more controversial, maybe. Or we're going to be talking about religion and racism in our next couple of shows. But listen to some of the music as we go out. And thanks again to Bob Levin.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.